I'm just going to continue on page 37 of this manuscript in a section called Is Reason Unified by Universalistic Presuppositions? Unlike Habermas, I don't think that disciplines like philosophy, linguistics, and developmental psychology can do much for democratic politics. I see the development of the social conventions in which Habermas and I both rejoice as a lucky accident. Still, I'd be happy to think I'd be wrong about this, I'd be happy to think that I was wrong about this. Maybe the gradual development of these conventions, that is, the gradual development of the social practices which make up the basis of liberal society, maybe the gradual development of those conventions does, as Habermas thinks, illustrate a universal pattern of philo- or ontogenetic development, a pattern captured by the rational reconstruction of competences offered by various human sciences and illustrated by the transition from traditional to modern rationalized societies. But unlike Habermas, I should be unperturbed if the offers currently made by the human sciences were withdrawn. For example, if Chomsky's universalistic ideas about communicative competence were repudiated by a connectionist revolution in artificial intelligence. I have a footnote saying that Davidson's argument in his article, A Nice Derangement of Epitaphs, against the sort of MIT language learning reconstruction of communicative competence in terms of Chomskyan fundamental grammar seems to be, this Davidsonian point that we don't really need the idea of mastering a set of grammatical rules in order to understand language learning seems to be being supported by connectionist programs in artificial intelligence. I don't know whether this is true or not. I just put it in as an example of a change in the opinion of linguists, an anti-Chomsky revolution in linguistics, which it seems to me wouldn't greatly matter to philosophers or political thinkers, but I think Habermas goes out on a limb in his attachment to Chomsky and his use of Chomsky's notion of competence as a sort of structural device for his own work. I should be unperturbed if Chomsky's ideas were repudiated, if Piaget's and Kohlberg's empirical results proved to be unduplicatable, and so on. I don't see that it matters much whether there are social patterns here. I don't much care whether democratic politics is an expression of something deep or whether it expresses nothing better than some hopes which popped from nowhere into the brains of a few remarkable people like Socrates, Christ, Jefferson, and so on, and which for unknown reasons became popular. Habermas and Oppel think that the way to create a cosmopolitan community is to study the nature of something called rationality, which all human beings share, something already present within them but insufficiently acknowledged. That's why they would be depressed if the offers made by Chomsky, Kohlberg, etc. were, in the course of time, withdrawn. But suppose we say that all that rationality amounts to, all that marks human beings off from other species of animals, is the ability to use language and thus to have sentential attitudes like beliefs and desires. It seems plausible to add that there is no more reason to expect all the organisms which share this ability to form a single community of justification than to expect such a community to unite all the organisms able to walk long distances or to remain monogamous or to digest vegetables. One will not expect such a single community of justification to be created by the ability to communicate if one takes the ability to use language to be, like the prehensile thumb, just one more gimmick which organisms have developed to increase their chances of survival. If we combine this Darwinian point of view with the holistic attitude toward intentionality and language use found in Wittgenstein and Davidson, we shall say that there is no language use without justification, no ability to believe without an ability to argue about what beliefs to have. But this is not to say that the ability to use language to have beliefs and desires entails a desire to justify one's belief to every language-using organism one encounters. It's not to say that any language user who comes down the road will be treated as a member of a competent audience. On the contrary, human beings usually divide up into mutually suspicious, not mutually unintelligible, communities of justification, mutually exclusive groups depending on the presence or absence of sufficient overlap in belief and desire. The principal source of conflict between human communities is the belief that I have no reason to justify my beliefs to you, and none in finding out what alternative beliefs you may have, because you are, for example, an infidel, a foreigner, a woman, a child, a slave, a pervert, or an untouchable. In short, you're not one of us, not one of the real human beings, the paradigm human beings, the ones whose persons and opinions are to be treated with respect. The philosophical tradition has tried to stitch exclusivist communities together by saying there's more overlap between infidels and true believers, masters and slaves, men and women, than you might have thought. For, as Aristotle said, all human beings by nature desire to know. This desire brings them together in a universal community of justification. To a pragmatist, however, this Aristotelian dictum seems thoroughly misleading. It runs together three different things: the need to make one's beliefs coherent, the need for the respect of one's peers, and curiosity. We pragmatists think that the reason people try to make their beliefs coherent is not that they love truth, but because they can't help doing so. Our minds can no more stand incoherence than our brains can stand whatever the neurochemical substrate of such coherence may be. Just as our neural networks are presumably both constrained and in part constructed by something like the algorithms used in parallel distributed processing of information by computer programmers, so our minds are constrained by the need to tie our beliefs and desires together into a reasonably perspicuous whole. That's why we can't, in James's unhappy expression, will to believe what we like regardless of what else we believe. It's why, for example, we have such a hard time keeping our religious beliefs in a separate compartment from our scientific ones, and in isolating our respect for democratic institutions from our contempt for many or most of our fellow voters. The need to make one's beliefs coherent is, for reasons familiar from Hegel, Mead, and Davidson, not separable from the need for the respect of our peers. We have as hard a time tolerating the thought that everybody but ourselves is out of step as we do the thought that we believe both P and not P. We need the respect of our peers because we cannot trust our own beliefs nor maintain our self-respect unless we're fairly sure that our conversational interlocutors agree among themselves on such propositions as, he's not crazy, he's one of us, he may have strange beliefs on some subjects, but he's basically sound, and so on. This interpenetration of the need to make one's beliefs coherent among themselves and the need to make them coherent with most of those of one's peers results from the fact that, as Wittgenstein said, to imagine a form of human life, we have to imagine agreement in judgments as well as in meanings. Davidson brings out the considerations which support Wittgenstein's insight when he says, quote, "The ultimate source of both objectivity and communication is the triangle that, by relating speaker, interpreter, and the world, determines the contents of thought and speech." You would not know what you believed, nor have any beliefs, unless your belief had a place in a network of beliefs and desires, but that network would also not exist were you and others unable to pair off features of your non-human environment with assent to your utterances by other language users, utterances caused, as are yours, by those very features. The difference between the use which Davidson and I would like to make of Hegel's and Mead's realization that ourselves are dialogical all the way down, that there is no private core on which to build, and the use which Habermas make of this point can be exhibited by looking at the sentence immediately following the one I just quoted from Davidson. Davidson continues, "Given this source," that is, given that the source of both objectivity and communication is this triangle, "there is no room for a relativized concept of truth." Davidson's point is that the only sort of philosopher who would take seriously the idea that truth is relative to a context, and particularly to a choice between human communities, is one who thinks that he or she can contrast being in touch with a human community with being in touch with reality. But Davidson's point about there being no language without triangulation means that this contrast can't be drawn. You can't have any language or any beliefs without being in touch with both a human community and non-human reality. There's no possibility of agreement without truth, nor of truth without agreement. Most of our beliefs must be true, Davidson says, because an ascription to a person of mostly false beliefs would mean either that we had mistranslated the person's marks and noises, or that she didn't, in fact, have any beliefs, was not, in fact, speaking a language. Most of our beliefs must be justified in the eyes of our peers for a similar reason. If they were not justified, if our peers could not attribute to us a largely coherent web of beliefs and desires, they would have to conclude that they had either misunderstood us, they would have to conclude either that they had misunderstood us or that we did not speak their language. Coherence, truth, and community go together, not because truth is to be defined in terms of coherence rather than correspondence, in terms of social practice rather than in terms of coping with non-human forces, but simply because to ascribe a belief is automatically to ascribe a place in a largely coherent set of mostly true beliefs. But to say that there's no contact via belief and desire with reality, no truth without community, is as yet to say nothing about what sort of community is in question. A radically exclusivist community made up of only the priests or the nobles or the males or the whites is quite as good as any other sort of community for Davidsonian purposes. This is the difference between what Davidson thinks you can get out of reflection on the nature of discourse and what Oppel and Habermas think you can get out of it. The latter philosophers think that you can get something more out of such reflection than the fact that there are neither beliefs nor persons nor truth without justification in the eyes of a community. They think you can get an argument in favor of the inclusivist project, an argument which says that people who resist this project involve themselves in performative self-contradictions. By contrast, Davidson thinks that any community of justification will do to make you a language user and a believer, no matter how distorted Oppel and Habermas take communication within that community to be. From Davidson's point of view, philosophy of language runs out before we reach the moral imperatives which make up Oppel's and Habermas's discourse ethics. Oppel and Habermas run together the need for coherence and for justification, which is required if one is to use language at all, and a commitment to what they call universal validity, a commitment which can only be consistently acted upon by aiming at the sort of domination-free communication which is impossible as long as there are human communities which remain exclusivist. Davidson and I have no use for the claim that any communicative action contains a claim to universal validity, because this so-called presupposition seems to us to have no role to play in the explanation of linguistic behavior. It does, to be sure, play a part in the explanation of the behavior, linguistic and other, of a small minority of human beings, those who belong to the liberal universalistic inclusivist tradition of the European Enlightenment. But this tradition, to which Davidson and I are as much attached as Oppel and Habermas, derives no support from reflection on discourse as such. We language users who belong to this minority tradition are morally superior to those who don't, but those who don't are no less coherent in their use of language. Oppel and Habermas invoke the presupposition of universal validity to get from a commitment to justification to a willingness to submit one's beliefs to the inspection of any and every language user, even a slave, even a black, even a woman. They see the desire for truth construed as the desire to claim universal validity as the desire for universal justification. But as I see it, they're inferring invalidly from you can't use language without invoking a consensus within a community of other language users to you can't use language consistently without enlarging that community to include all users of language. Because I see this inference as invalid, I think that the only thing which can play the role in which Aristotle, Peirce, Oppel, and Habermas have cast the desire for knowledge, and thus for truth, is curiosity. I use this term to mean the urge to expand one's horizons of inquiry, in all areas, ethical as well as logical and physical, so as to encompass new data, new hypotheses, new terminologies, and the like. This urge brings cosmopolitanism and democratic politics in its train. The more curiosity you have, the more interest you will have in talking to foreigners, infidels, and anybody else who claims to know something you don't know, to have some ideas you have not yet had. Section 6, communicating or educating. If one sees the desire and possession of both truth and justification as inseparable from using language, while still resisting the thought that this desire can be used to convict members of exclusivist human communities of performative self-contradiction, then one will see inclusivist communities as based on contingent human development, such as the twitchy curiosity of the sort of eccentrics we call intellectuals, the desire for intermarriage beyond tribal or caste boundaries produced by erotic obsession, the need to trade across such boundaries produced by lack of, for example, salt or gold within one's own territory, the possession of enough wealth, security, education, and independence so that one's self-respect no longer depends upon membership in an exclusivist community, e.g. on not being an infidel or a slave or a woman, and the like. The increased communication between previously exclusivist communities produced by such contingent human developments may gradually create universality, but I can't see any sense in which it recognizes a previously existent universality. Philosophers like Habermas, who worry about the anti-Enlightenment overtones of the views they call contextualist, think that since justification is an obviously context-relative notion, one justifies to a given audience, and the same justification won't work for all audiences, it endangers the ideal of human fraternity. Habermas regards contextualism as only the flip side of logocentrism. He sees contextualists as negative metaphysicians infatuated by diversity, and says that, quote, the metaphysical priority of unity above plurality and the contextualist priority of plurality above unity are secret accomplices. The idea is that postmoderns in the tradition of Nietzsche, including me, for these purposes, are plurality freaks in the same way that the Western metaphysical tradition condemned by Heidegger and Derrida were unity freaks, whereas Habermas is neither a unity freak nor a plurality freak, but just right. I agree with Habermas that it's as pointless to prize diversity as to prize unity, but I disagree with him that we can use the pragmatics of communication to do the job which metaphysicians hope to achieve by appealing to the Platonian one or to the transcendental structure of self-consciousness. My reasons for disagreement are those offered by Walzer, McCarthy, Ben Habib, Velmer, and others, reasons nicely summed up in an article by Michael Kelly that I cite in the footnote. Habermas argues for the thesis that, quote, the unity of reason only remains perceptible in the plurality of its voices, as the possibility and principle of passing from one language to another, a passage that, no matter how occasional, is still comprehensible. This possibility of mutual understanding, which is now guaranteed only procedurally and is realized only transitorily, forms the background for the existing diversity of those who encounter one another even when they fail to understand one another. I agree with Habermas against Lyotard, Foucault, and others that there are no incommensurable languages, that any language can be learned by one who is able to use any other language, that Davidson is right in denouncing the very idea of a conceptual scheme. But I disagree with him about the relevance of this point to the utility of the ideas of universal validity and objective truth. Habermas says that, quote, what the speaker here and now in a given context asserts as valid transcends, according to the sense of his claim, all context-dependent, merely local standards of validity. As I said before, I can't see what transcends means here. If it means that he's claiming to say something true, then the question is whether it makes any difference whether you say that a sentence S is true or whether you simply offer a justification for it by saying, here are my reasons for believing S. Habermas thinks there's a difference because he thinks that when you assert S, you claim truth you claim to represent the real and that reality transcends context. I quote, "With the concept of reality to which every representation necessarily refers, we presuppose something transcendent." Here, in my view, is where the notion of representation raises its ugly head in Habermas and offers us a reason for, never saying that sentences represent reality. Habermas tends to take for granted that truth claims are claims to represent accurately and to be suspicious of those who, like Davidson and myself, give up on the notion of linguistic representation. He follows Sellers in being a coherentist rather than a skeptic or a foundationalist, but he's dubious about the move I want to make from coherentism to anti-representationalism. He commends Peirce over Saussure because Peirce, quote, "examines expressions from the point of view of their possible truth and at the same time from that of their communicability." He goes on to say, quote, "From the perspective of its capacity for being true, an assertoric sentence stands in an epistemic relation to something in the world. It represents a state of affairs. At the same time, from the perspective of its employment in a communicative act, it stands in a relation to a possible interpretation by a language user. It's suitable for the transmission of information." My own view, which I take from Davidson, is that you can give up the notion of an epistemic relation to something in the world and just rely on the ordinary causal relations which bind utterances together with the utterer's environments. The idea of representation on this view adds nothing to the notion of transmission of information, or more exactly, it adds nothing to the notion of taking part in the discursive practice of justifying one's assertions. Habermas sees Putnam as, like himself, defending a third position over against the metaphysics of unity on the one hand, and people like me, the enthusiasts for incommensurability, on the other. He thinks I'm an enthusiast for incommensurability. He defines this third position as, quote, "the humanism of those who continue the Kantian tradition by seeking to use the philosophy of language to save a concept of reason that is skeptical and post-metaphysical." Putnam and Habermas have offered similar criticisms of my attempt to get rid of a specifically epistemic concept of reason, the concept according to which one is rational only if one tries to represent reality accurately, and to replace it by the purely moral idea of solidarity. My central disagreement with both Habermas and Putnam is is over the question of whether the regulative ideas of undistorted communication or accurate representation of reality can do any more for the ideals of the French Revolution than the bare context-dependent notion of justification. Some people care about defending their assertions only to a few people, and some care, or say they care, about defending their assertions to everyone. I'm not thinking here of the distinction between specialized technical discourse and non-technical discourse. Rather, the distinction I want is the one between people who want to defend their views to all people who share certain attributes. For example, devotion to the ideals of the French Revolution or membership in the Aryan race, and those who say they want to justify their view to every actual and possible language user. There are certainly people who say that the latter is what they want, but I'm not sure they really mean it. Do they want to justify their views to language users who are 4 years old? Well, perhaps they do in the sense that they would like to educate 4-year-olds to the point at which they could appreciate the arguments for and against views in question. Do they want to justify them to intelligent but convinced Nazis, people who believe that the first thing to find out is whether the view under discussion is tainted by the Jewish ancestry of its inventors or propounders? Well, perhaps they do, in the sense that they would like to convert these Nazis into people who have doubts about the advisability of a Jew-free Europe and the infallibility of Hitler, and therefore are more or less willing to listen to arguments for positions associated with Jewish thinkers. But in both cases, what they want seems to me best described not as wanting to justify their view to everybody, but as wanting to create an audience to whom they would have a sporting chance of justifying their view. Let me use the distinction between arguing with people and educating people to abbreviate the distinction I've just drawn. The distinction between proceeding on the assumption that people will follow your arguments and knowing that they cannot, but hoping to alter them so that they can. If all education were a matter of argument, this distinction would collapse. But unless one broadens the term argument beyond recognition, a lot of education is not. In particular, a lot of it is simple appeal to sentiment. The distinction between such appeal and argument is fuzzy, but I take it nobody would say that making an unregenerate Nazi watch films of the opening of the concentration camps or making her read the diary of Anne Frank counts as arguing with her. People interested in democratic politics both cherish the ideal of human fraternity and cherish the idea of the universal availability of education. When asked about the education we have in mind, we often say that it is education in critical thinking, in the ability to talk over the pros and cons of any view. We oppose critical thinking to ideology and say that we oppose ideological education of the sort which the Nazis inflicted on German youth. But we thereby leave ourselves wide open to Nietzsche's scornful suggestion that we are simply inculcating our own ideology, the ideology of what he calls Socratism. The issue between me and Habermas, I think, boils down to a disagreement about what to say to Nietzsche at this point. I should reply to Nietzsche by conceding that there is no non-local, non-contextual way to draw the distinction between ideological education and non-ideological education, because there's nothing to say to my use of the term reason that could not be replaced by the way we wet Western liberals, the heirs of Socrates and the French Revolution, conduct ourselves. I agree with McIntyre and Michael Kelly that all reasoning, both in physics and ethics, is tradition-bound. Habermas thinks this an unnecessary concession, and more generally thinks that my cheerful ethnocentrism can be avoided by thinking through what he calls the symmetrical structure of perspectives built into every speech situation. The issue between Habermas and myself thus comes to a head when he takes up my suggestion that we drop the notions of rationality and objectivity and instead just discuss the kind of community we want to create. He paraphrases this suggestion by saying that I want to treat the aspiration for objectivity as, quote, simply the desire for as much intersubjective agreement as possible, namely the desire to expand the referent of for us to the greatest possible extent. Habermas then paraphrases one of Putnam's objections to me by asking, quote, can we explain the possibility of the critique and self-critique of established practices of justification if we do not take the idea of the expansion of our interpreted horizon seriously as an idea, and if we do not connect this idea with the intersubjectivity of an agreement that allows precisely for the distinction between what is current for us and what is current for them. Habermas enlarges on this point by saying, quote, the merging of interpretive horizons does not signify an assimilation to us. Rather, it must mean a convergence steered through learning of our perspective and their perspective, no matter whether they or we or both sides have to reformulate established practices of justification to a greater or lesser extent. For learning itself belongs neither to us or to them. Both sides are caught up on it in the same way. Even in the most difficult processes of reaching understanding, all parties appeal to the common reference point of a possible consensus, even if this reference point is projected in each case from within their own contexts. For although they may be interpreted in various ways and applied according to different criteria, concepts like truth, rationality, or justification play the same grammatical role in every linguistic community. End of quote. The nub of the argument is, I think, a disagreement about how much help for democratic politics can be gotten out of what Habermas here calls grammar. As I said earlier, I think that all we can get out of the grammar of the words true and rational is the same as what we get out of a rather thin idea of justification. This thin idea is the one we get when we answer the question, Where does the line come between causing people to adjust their behavior by persuasion, by working on their beliefs and desires, and doing so by other means? Unlike Foucault and some others, I think it's both possible and important to draw a line here. I don't think it helpful to extend the term violence as widely as Foucault extended it. Whatever we're doing when we make Nazis look at pictures of concentration camp survivors, it isn't violence any more than it was violence to educate the Hitler Youth to believe that Jews were worthless vermin. The inevitable fuzziness of the line between persuasion and violence causes problems, however, when we come to the question of education. We're reluctant to say that the Nazis used persuasion on the Hitler Youth, since we have two criteria of persuasion. One is simply using words rather than blows or other forms of physical pressure. One can imagine, with a bit of distortion of history, that in this sense only persuasion was employed on the Hitler Youth. The second criterion of persuasion includes abstention from words like, stop asking these stupid questions about whether there aren't some good Jews, questions which make me doubt your Aryan consciousnness and ancestry, or the Reich will find another use for you. Those are not blows, but one might say it isn't exactly persuasion either. It's, threats or something that doesn't quite deserve the name persuasion. Another example is abstention from not assigning Der Stürmer to one student. Unsocratic methods of this latter sort are the kind which Habermas would say do not respect the symmetrical relationships of participants in discourse. Habermas clearly thinks that there's something in the grammar of concepts like truth, rationality, and justification which tell us not to use methods of the latter sort. He would presumably grant that the use of such words is language use, but he needs a category of distorted language use, or distorted communication, to explain that it is, so to speak, ungrammatical language use. Immediately after the passage I quoted about grammar, Habermas says, quote, all languages offer the possibility of distinguishing what is true and what we hold to be true. The supposition of a common objective world is built into the pragmatics of every single linguistic usage, and the dialogue roles of every speech situation enforce a symmetry in participant perspective. A bit later he says, quote, from the possibility of reaching understanding linguistically, we can read off a concept of situated reason that is given voice in validity claims that are both context-dependent and transcendent. He then approvingly quotes Putnam as saying, reason is in this sense both immanent, not to be found outside of concrete language games and institutions, and transcendent, i.e. a regulative idea that we use to criticize the conduct of all activities and institutions. It seems to me that the regulative ideal that we wet liberals, we heirs of the Enlightenment, we Socratists, most frequently use to criticize the conduct of various conversational partners is the concept of needing education in order to outgrow their primitive fears, hatreds, and superstitions. This is the concept the victorious Allied armies used when they set about re-educating the citizens of occupied Germany and Japan. It's also the one which was used by American school teachers who had read Dewey and were concerned to get students to think scientifically and rationally about such matters as the origin of the species and sexual behavior. That is, to get the students to read Darwin and Freud without disgust or incredulity. It is a concept which I, like most Americans who teach humanities or social science in colleges and universities, use when we hope that the students who enter as bigoted religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. What's the relation of this idea to the regulative idea of reason, which Putnam believes to be transcendent and which Habermas believes to be discoverable within the grammar of concepts, ineliminable from our description of the making of assertions? The answer to that question depends upon how much the re-education of Nazis and fundamentalists has to do with merging interpretive horizons and how much with replacing such horizons. The fundamentalist parents of my fundamentalist students think that the entire liberal establishment is engaged in a conspiracy. Had they read Habermas, these people would say that the typical communication situation in American college classrooms, or at least my classroom, is no more Herrschaftsfrei, no more domination-free than that in the Hitler Youth camps. These parents have a point. Their point is that we liberal teachers no more feel in a symmetrical communication situation when we talk with our fundamentalist students than do kindergarten teachers with their students. In both college classrooms and kindergartens, it is equally difficult for the teachers to feel that what is going on is what Habermas calls a convergence steered through learning of our perspective and their perspective, no matter whether they or we or both sides have to reformulate established practices of justification to a greater or lesser extent. When we American college teachers encounter religious fundamentalists, we do not consider the possibility of reformulating our own practices of justification so as to give more authority to the weight of the Christian Scripture, more weight to the authority of the Christian Scriptures. Instead, we do our best to convince these persons of the benefits of secularization. We assign, for example, first-person accounts of growing up homosexual to our homophobic students for the same reasons that German school teachers in the post-war period assigned the Diary of Anne Frank. Putnam and Habermas can rejoin that we teachers do our best to be Socratic, to get our job of re-education, secularization, and liberalization done by conversational exchange. That's true up to a point, but what about assigning books like Black Boy, The Diary of Anne Frank, and A Boy's Life? The racist or fundamentalist parents of our students say that in a truly democratic society, the student should not be forced to read books by such people. Black people, Jewish people, homosexual people, and so on. They'll protest that these books are being jammed down their children's throats. I can't see how to reply to this charge without saying something like, there are credentials for admission to our democratic society, credentials which we liberals have been making steadily more stringent by doing our best to excommunicate racists, male chauvinists, homophobes, and so on. You have to be educated in order to be a citizen of our society, a participant in our conversation, someone with whom we can envisage merging our horizons. So we're going to go right on, trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. We are not so inclusivist as to tolerate intolerance such as yours. I have no trouble offering this reply because I don't claim to make the distinction between education and conversation on the basis of anything except loyalty to a particular community. A community whose interests required re-educating the Hitler Youth in 1945 and re-educating the children of southwestern Virginia in 1996. I don't see anything Herrschaftsfrei about my handling of my fundamentalist students. I think those students are lucky to find themselves under the Herrschaft of people like me and to have escaped from their rather frightening and dangerous parents. So I think that the handling of such students is a problem for Putnam and Habermas. It seems to me that I'm just as provincial and contextualist as the Nazi teachers who made their students read Der Stürmer. The only difference is that I serve a better cause. I come from a better province. I recognize, of course, that domination-free communication is only a regulative ideal, never to be attained in practice. But unless a regulative ideal makes a difference to practice, it isn't good for much. So I ask, is there an ethics of discourse which lets me assign the books I want to assign, but makes no reference to the local and ethnocentric considerations which I should cite to justify my pedagogic practices? Can you get such an ethics out of the notions of reason, truth, and justification, or do you have to load the dice? Can I invoke universalistic notions in defense of my action as well as local ones? Like McIntyre, Ben Habib, Kelly, and others, I think that you have to smuggle some provinciality into your universals before they do you any good. We think this for the same sorts of reasons as Hegel thought you had to smuggle in some provinciality, some ethical substance, before you could get any use out of Kant's notion of unconditional moral obligation. In particular, you have to smuggle in some rule like No putative contribution to a conversation can be rejected simply because it comes from somebody who has some attribute which can vary independently of his or her opinions, an attribute like being Jewish or black or homosexual. I call this rule provincial because it violates the intuitions of a lot of people outside the province in which we heirs of the Enlightenment run the educational institutions. It violates what they would describe as their moral intuitions. I'm reluctant to admit that these are moral intuitions and should prefer to call them revolting prejudices. But I don't think that anything in the grammar of the term moral intuition or revolting prejudice helps us to reach agreement on this point, nor can I see that a theory of rationality, abandoning the hopeless question, how can philosophy find politically neutral premises which can be justified to anybody from which to infer an obligation to pursue democratic ethics. Dropping that question would let us admit, in Velmer's formula, that democratic and liberal principles define just one possible language game among others. Such an admission would be in line with the Darwinian idea that the inclusivist project is no more rooted in something larger than itself than, say, the project of replacing ideographic by alphabetic writing or of representing three spatial dimensions on a two-dimensional surface. All three of these were good, immensely fruitful ideas, but none of them need universalistic backup. They can stand on their own feet. If we abandon the idea of philosophy which manages to be both politically neutral and politically relevant, we could start asking the question, given that we want to be ever more inclusivist, what should the public rhetoric of our society be like? How different should it be from the public rhetoric of previous societies? Habermas's implicit answer to this question is that we should hang on to a good many Kantian ideas about the connection between universality and moral obligation. Dewey, however, was willing to move much further away from Kant. Though he would have heartily agreed with Habermas that Aristotle's political vocabulary was unable to capture the spirit of democratic politics, he did not like the distinction between morality and prudence, which Habermas thinks essential, and on this point he would have thought Aristotle preferable. Dewey thought that the Kantian notion of unconditional obligation, like the notion of unconditionality itself, and of universality insofar as that idea is implicitly accompanied by that of unconditional necessity, could not survive Darwin. Whereas Habermas thinks that we need what he calls the reconstructive sciences designed to grasp universal competences in order to break out of what he calls the hermeneutic circle in which the Geisteswissenschaften as well as the interpretive social sciences are trapped, Dewey did not feel trapped. This was because he saw no need to resolve a tension between facticity and validity. He saw that tension as a philosopher's fiction, as a result of separating out two parts of a situation for no good, that is to say, no practical reason, and then complaining that they can't be put back together again. For him, all obligations were situational and conditional. This refusal to be unconditional led Dewey to be charged with relativism. If relativism just means failure to find a use for the notion of context-independent validity, then the charge was entirely justified. But no roads lead from this failure to an inability to engage in democratic politics unless one thinks that such politics require us to deny that, in Velmer's formula, democratic and liberal principles define just one possible language game among others. The question about universality is for Dewey just the question of whether democratic politics can start from an affirmation rather than a denial of that claim. I don't think we can get much further in debating that question by talking about either modernity or reason. The question of whether Hegel should have stuck to the topic of reason by developing a theory of communicative reason, or should instead have dropped the topic and simply politicized philosophy, is not going to be settled by looking more closely at the grammar of words like true, rational, and argument. I'm referring here to a passage in Habermas's Philosophical Discourse of Modernity where he says, Hegel had this great opportunity. If he had gone on to become, let us say, Brandom, and developed a theory of communicative reason, he would have had it made, but because he was stuck with the philosophy of consciousness, he missed the chance, and we had to wait for another 150 years before Habermas and Brandom came along with a theory of communicative reason. Neither is the question of whether philosophers like Annette Beyer are right in suggesting that we set Kant aside and go back to Hume's attempt to describe reason in terms of conditioned sentiment rather than unconditional obligation. That is, whether Beyer is right in her view of Kant isn't to be settled by thinking harder about what we mean by true rational argument. But although we don't, if I'm right, need a theory of rationality, we do need a narrative of maturation. As I see it, the deepest disagreement between Habermas and myself is about whether the distinction between the unconditional and the conditional in general, and the distinction between morality and prudence in particular, is a mark of maturity or a transitional stage on the way to maturity. One of the many points on which Dewey agreed with Nietzsche was that it was the latter. Dewey thought that the desire for universality, unconditionality, and necessity was undesirable because it led one away from the practical problems of democratic politics into a never-never land of theory. Kant and Habermas think it's a desirable desire, one which one shares only when one reaches the highest level of moral development. In this paper, I've tried to show how things look when one puts democratic politics in the context of Dewey's narrative of maturation. I can't offer anything remotely approaching a knockdown argument based on commonly accepted premises for this narrative. The best I could do by way of further defense of my view would be to tell a fuller story encompassing more topics in order to show how post-Nietzschean European philosophy looks from a Deweyan angle rather than a universalistic one. This is something I've tried to do in bits and pieces in various articles. I think that narratives are a perfectly fair means of persuasion, and that Habermas's book, The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, and Dewey's The Quest for Certainty, like, for example, Kant's What is Enlightenment, and Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, are both admirable illustrations of the power of narratives of maturation. My reasons for preferring Dewey's to Habermas's narrative are not that I think Dewey got truth and rationality right and that Habermas gets them wrong. I think that there's nothing to be gotten right or wrong here. At this level of abstraction, concepts like truth, rationality, and maturity are up for grabs. The only thing that matters is which way of reshaping them will, in the long run, make them more useful for democratic politics. Concepts are, as Wittgenstein taught us, uses of words. Philosophers have long wanted to understand concepts, but the point is to change them so as to make them serve our purposes better. Habermas's, Oppel's, Putnam's, and Velmer's linguistification of Kantian concepts is one suggestion about how to make these Kantian concepts more useful. Dewey's and Davidson's thoroughgoing anti-Kantian naturalism is another suggestion.